The human use of human beings. Why artificial intelligence is only part of the problem. It is a special pleasure for me to welcome you, dear ladies and gentlemen, but especially you, dear Daniel, and dear Jutta Almendinger, there, Holly Case, Rainer Forst, Sarah Mohammed, and above all, dear Mitchell Ash, to the Einsteinsaal for this traditional event, as you have said, with the American Academy. To begin my welcome, I would like to take you briefly from the Einstein Hall of the Academy at Gendarmenmarkt to a still empty former ruinous site on Leipziger Straße, between the Ministry of Finance and the Museum for Post and Communication. Some will know that an extension to the Ministry of Finance was planned there, which the Federal Minister of Finance simply cancelled as a contribution to the urgently needed budget restructuring. But that is not my topic today. Some time ago, a veritable detached house made of wood stood on the empty, once ruined site as benefits the times of sustainable construction. It was built by Deutsche Telekom, which now operates the former Post Ministry and Post Museum, and apparently also owns the empty plot. The single-family home was intended to demonstrate that it is already possible to operate your home largely automatically with the help of Deutsche Telekom's services. Before I even get home, the heating kicks on and makes everything warm. My favorite music is played on the hi-fi system to greet me. A delicious Kaiserschmarren is already sizzling happily in the oven to play a local specialty of Mitch's place of residence. As I like to take a bath before eating, the bath water is already running, and so on and so forth. The house has since been demolished, but you can still see the fence with the advert in front of its former location. In German, we are familiar with the anxious question, bin ich immer noch der Herr im Hause? Perhaps able to translate, am I still master of the house? Bin ich noch der Herr im Haus? Am I still the master of the telecom house? Or has my autonomy and freedom become a victim of my convenience? To put it more sharply, has Deutsche Telekom brought me my life from me, and a larger server somewhere in distant lands is deciding how my life goes? After all, it's not a foregone conclusion that I will still be able to determine the heating temperature, choose my favorite music, and compose the recipes for Kaiserschmarren. It could also be my health insurance company, the Federal Ministry for the Environment, the Berlin Gas Works, or whatever and whoever, but certainly not me. I wondered whether Deutsche Telekom's house, which has since disappeared again, should actually be called a house of horrors, or simply a particularly comfortable house. Should I freeze for a while before coming home and run the bath myself? After all, it's all much quicker than when my grandparents still had to heat the oven. What is irresponsibility Again, how far are we still masters in our own house? What is irresponsibility? What is convenience? And what is a loss of autonomy? Deutsche Telekom's house is really just a metaphor that makes all such questions particularly pressing. And the questions have not disappeared, even though the house no longer exists. I'm extremely grateful to Mitch Ash for once again organizing such a clever panel on such an exciting and hot topic, combining this year's fellows of the American Academy, all fellows a warm welcome in this Einstein Hall, with members of our Academy, also all members of our Academy, a warm welcome. And I'm sincerely grateful to Daniel Benjamin for his wonderful new and now ongoing sign of trusting cooperation between our academies, which we cultivate in many areas and which is particularly important in times like these. There is not only a budget crisis, but a lot of crises. After all, the horror visions of an overheated or undercooled telecom building, of overflowing bath tubes and other AI malfunctions in this house only seem like a particularly entertaining slapstick comedy from television. When we come to questions of warfare with AI, drones and remote-controlled fighting machines, when we look at questions of economic and opinion management, the funny comedy quickly turns into a tragedy. If I'm right, the European Union has shown us how artificial intelligence can be legally regulated without being a machine assassin and yet still be used in an offensive and at the same time responsible manner. Two academies, like our two, could hardly be more up-to-date with their topic, I think. I wish you all, dear ladies and gentlemen, and especially the participants, a stimulating evening, and thank those responsible for it again and again. Thank you.
Christoph, it's always wonderful to be back in the Berlin-Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaft. It's particularly a delight because I'm always reminded of the breadth and depth of your erudition. It's a bittersweet experience because I'm also reminded of the thinness of my own, but it's always great to be here, and we have, as you and as Mitch mentioned, had many excellent events here. This is, in fact, I believe our third AI event in a matter of 2 weeks at the American Academy, and I was reminded at our last one that AI has taken on, or KI if you're Deutschsprachig, that it has taken on the kind of character of something that happened in one of Don DeLillo's great novels, a novel entitled White Noise, in which there is a toxic event that occurs in the midst of the action. And the actual characteristics of the toxic event are never fully described, but we know that it is some kind of cloud that has been released from a train car, and it is moving inexorably northward, if I recall correctly, in New Jersey. And so it is the backdrop, and it provides this kind of anxiety, and you never quite know what's going to happen, and you never know when it's going to hit, but it is coming nonetheless. Well, AI is undoubtedly going to do lots of great things for us as well, but it does bring with it this undertone of anxiety, and I'm guessing that that will be a major part of tonight's discussion. We have quite a number of erudite people here this evening, and I really want to thank you to Almendinger and Rainer Forst for joining, as well as our Axel Springer Fellow Holly Case, and our Anna Maria Kellen Fellow Sarah Mohammed, who has been felled by something far more primitive than artificial intelligence. In fact, she has a virus, but will be appearing remotely thanks to technology, or that ambivalent thing that we possess, will be appearing on the screen. So anyway, this is an extraordinarily high-quality gathering of minds, and I want to once again thank Professor Mitchell Ash for putting it all together. As you both mentioned, we have done a number of things together. The Transatlantic Community of Values back in 1919. I'm sorry? What did I say? 1919? Versailles. We were at Versailles together. That was it. Yes, I feel old. All right, in 2020, we did a joint online event on German unification, and that was excellent. So I have very little else to say except that I'm fascinated by this topic. I have a feeling that we'll be doing a great deal more on it. I'm glad I don't live in that telecom house myself. My house in Vermont, the heat rattles remarkably, and it feels a little bit like 1919 there. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Mitch, and again, thank you very much.
Thanks to the two presidents for their kind remarks. I'll make a brief opening statement, and then we will move on to our podium discussion. In 1950, Norbert Wiener, the primary founder of cybernetics, published a book entitled The Human Use of Human Beings, revised in 1954, and that is, of course, the source of the title of our event this evening. In this book, Wiener reflected on the social and cultural implications of an increasingly automated economy and society. As he understood the transformation already being wrought by computer technology in his day was a chapter in the history of modern existence itself, which philosophical anthropologists had described earlier as the transition to an artificial world in which human interactions with science-based technology substituted for contact with the natural world. Toward the end of the book, Wiener issued a warning, I'm quote now, "Any machine constructed for the purpose of making decisions, if it does not possess the power of learning, will be completely literal-minded. Woe to us if we let it decide our conduct. On the other hand, a machine which can learn and can make decisions will in no way be obliged to make such decisions as we should have made or would be acceptable to us." End of quote. Only 2 years later, in 1956, the summer research project on artificial intelligence at Dartmouth College, often called the birthplace of AI, took place. At this workshop, engineer Alan Newell and management theorist Herbert A. Simon presented what they called a logic machine, or logic theorist, LT. What they did was to write programs for computers to carry out intellectual operations non-verbally, determining on the basis of conversations with family and friends which operations to model, a kind of distant predecessor of what AI programs do now, only with much more data. What the LT provided was not a theory of intelligence, and they never said it would be, but rather machine-generated proofs of the theorems of the Principia Mathematica of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, a foundational work of symbolic logic. Newell and Simon did not propose to name what they had achieved artificial intelligence at the time, but proposed more neutral-sounding names to avoid controversy. What they presented came to be called weak AI, to distinguish it from Ross Ashby's brash claim of 1952, simply to copy the living brain, which was strong AI. Work aimed to achieve that goal came to be called by this name of strong AI only years later. Whether artificial intelligence could actually copy the living brain, or whether the term was to refer instead to writing software programs to carry out problem-solving operations that match or even outperform the human brain, but don't claim to replicate what the brain does, remains a central issue of scientific debate to this day. It would seem that weak AI has won. But as we know, current AI software programs are anything but weak. The technologies of our time are different in many ways from those of 1950, and yet the broader issues Wiener raised have changed surprisingly little. The latest phenomenally effective versions of AI software have led many commentators to ask yet again what Professor Markschies also asked: are we still in charge? Or have we become cyborgs now? In a sense, most of us have already become cyborgs as we walk the streets with earphones firmly in place, or mobile phones, which after all are computer chips encased in decorative plastic, held tightly to our ears or loosely in front of our lips. Meanwhile, tracking programs record immense amounts of data. In principle, we can opt out of the tracking programs, but most of us opt in, not out. Are we using the machines, or are they using us? The answer seems simple at first. The computers and the software programs are human inventions, so the technology is a means of utilizing us as human resources to achieve goals set by other humans. In a literal descriptive sense, this is a human use of human beings. But of course, that's not what Norbert Wiener had in mind when he chose the title of his book. As the statement just quoted shows, he meant the word human normatively and not descriptively. Perhaps he could have written humane instead of human. The subtitle of our discussion this evening shows or claims that AI is only part of the problem. And indeed, the dimensions of the topic raised by our title, the human use of human beings, go far beyond the issues raised in the AI debates as we know them. Robotics and other computer-driven or computer-aided technologies have transformed manufacturing, leading to radical changes in what it means to speak of skilled labor. One can ask, whose skilled labor? Or the skilled labor of what? We have all become familiar with the role of computers in the transformation in the service industries, especially when such services can't be provided because, as we are told, the computers are down. It's nearly impossible today to speak with customer service people or even buy a train ticket without running a virtual gauntlet of Q&A prompts which were allegedly designed to direct the provision of services more efficiently, but in fact drive customers to distraction. And often enough take so long to get through that users might legitimately wonder whether increasing efficiency or gathering data about performance and about us, the customers, is the real goal. Our panelist Holly Case will address these broader implications by informing us about how machines, as understood by Jan Amos Comenius, Paul Valéry, and Norbert Wiener, used to try to standardize and homogenize our behavior, but increasingly are as much about personalization of content, modes of interaction, treatment, marketing, and the like, which might lead to a reevaluation of what we even mean by the human use of human beings. Our panelist Jutta Almendinger now leads a PhD program, Doktoratskolleg in German, entitled The Future of Work in a Transformative World. She'll address the broader implications of our topic by discussing the changing organization of work. From Sarah Mohammed, we will learn about the human use or misuse of human beings in war and other forms of violent conflict. Of course, there's a connection to AI here. Israeli news media report that the Israel Defense Forces are using AI to choose targets for bombardment in the war against Hamas in Gaza. In war more generally, however, soldiers are often treated as expendable resources and enjoy little or no legal protection against such treatment. The expression cannon fodder in the title of the talk presented by Sarah at the American Academy only a few days ago puts the point quite clearly. And of course is taken from the German, Kanonenfutter. I'll conclude this introduction with a philosophical issue. In business and industry, personnel departments are now called human resources, or HR for short. Such language suggests that the treatment of human beings as objects of administration is hardly limited to the military, but rather has become normalized. The term human resources itself is deeply ambivalent. It comes from the concept of human capital, which was created in the first third of the 20th century. In its original version, The concept referred to the relative social value, in quotes, of, quote, human material, unquote, and was directly linked with eugenics. However, the concept also referred to the importance of quantifying human potential in order to realize that potential more effectively. The current term for this in management jargon and public discourse we know well as optimization. Talk of human resources appears to suggest that treating human beings as objects of administration is ethically justified. Is it? The ethics of Immanuel Kant would suggest that the answer is no. Our panelist Rainer Forst will help us address this question. A word now about how we proceed. I will introduce our distinguished panelists individually before their opening statements. After the first round of statements, I'll try to engage the panelists in discussion by asking pointed questions. After that, if there's time, and I hope there will be, we'll open the floor for questions or comments from members of the audience, or the Q&A on your screens. Those of you who are on Zoom can use the chat button. Thank you very much for listening to what I have to say, and now I ask the panelists to come forward. So, contrary to what was on the poster, we will begin with Holly Case, and you'll hear why in a minute. Holly is professor of history at Brown University and Axel Springer Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. She's a historian of modern Europe whose work focuses on the relations of foreign policy, social policy, science, and literature in the European state system of the 19th and 20th centuries. Her most recent book is called The Age of Questions, about when and why people started to organize politics around particular questions, such as the woman question, the Jewish question, or the Polish question, and how this altered the sense of political possibility in the 19th century, published in 2018 by Princeton University Press. This evening, Holly will discuss the work of Norbert Wiener and its context, including the things that I mentioned in my introduction, the transformation of what machines mean.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be part of this event. And I'd like to dive in so that we can get down to brass tacks. So as you know, the printing press was a transformative technology. It gave extra human range and duration to any argument, claim, or assertion. And as with other technologies, it did not stay in the domain of printing words on paper, which was the domain for which it was intended. It quickly became a metaphor, a way of thinking about context and scale and the human use of human beings. During the brutal 30 Years' War, the Bohemian scholar Jan Amos Comenius worked on a project that he called the Great Didactic, the whole art of teaching all things to all man. His personal slogan was omnes omnia omnini excoli, let everyone learn everything thoroughly. Everyone ought to receive a universal education, and this at a school, he wrote. He used the printing press as an extended metaphor to imagine mass education, transferring the logic of typography to what he termed didactography, which he described in this way. Instead of paper, we have pupils whose minds have to be impressed with the symbols of knowledge. Instead of type, we have the class books and the rest of the apparatus devised to facilitate the operation of teaching. The ink is replaced by the voice of the master, since this it is that conveys information from the books to the minds of the listener, while the press is school discipline, which keeps the pupils up to their work and compels them to learn. Education could work like a printing press, stamp and repeat, stamp and repeat, stamp and repeat. Scaling up education meant standardizing its form and also its content. His stated enemies were incompetent teachers and incorrect knowledge. Standardized methods and content promised to stamp out both in one go. Comenius applied the technology of the lifeless printing press to living children and living teachers. 3 centuries later, the French poet and writer Paul Valéry did the opposite. He described organizations and institutions, such as schools, large businesses, and governments, as effectively machines in their own right, which he likened to huge human beings with an inordinately oversized nervous system. This is what he said. Everything in them having to do with relations, transmission, agreement, and correspondence is magnified to the monstrous scale of 1 man per cell. They are endowed with a limitless memory, as fragile as the fiber of paper. That is where they get all their reflexes, which are laws, regulations, statutes, precedents. Not a single mortal is left unswallowed into the structure of these machines to become an object of their functioning, a nondescript element in their cycles. The life or death, the pleasures and works of men are details, means, incidents in the activity of these beings, whose rule is tempered only by the war they wage against each other. The man who wrote The Human Use of Human Beings, Norbert Wiener, didn't attend much school himself. A self-described infant prodigy in the full sense of the word, Wiener was mostly educated one-on-one and with severe intensity by his father, Leo Wiener. The young Wiener entered college before the age of 12, got his bachelor's degree before 15, and his doctorate before age 19. He studied math, zoology, and philosophy. Norbert Wiener could have done anything he wanted. What he wanted, in a way, was to continue to do everything. In 1940, he offered to apply his expertise to the problem of anticipating the position of bombers in order to design more accurate anti-aircraft weapons. He created something called an anti-aircraft, or AA, predictor. Like Comenius with the printing press, Wiener had a romance with his AA predictor as a metaphor. Historian of science Peter Galison described Wiener's trajectory this way. In the course of characterizing the enemy pilot's actions and designing a machine to forecast his future moves, Wiener's ambitions rose beyond the pilot, even beyond the World War. Step by step, Wiener came to see the predictor as a prototype not only of the mind of the inaccessible Axis opponent, but of the Allied anti-aircraft gunner as well, and then even more widely to include the vast array of human proprioceptive and electrophysiological feedback systems. The model then expanded to become a new science known after the war as cybernetics, a science that would embrace intentionality, learning, and much else within the human mind. Finally, the AA predictor, along with its associated engineering notions of feedback systems and black boxes, became for Wiener the model for the cybernetic understanding of the universe itself. To popularize and refine his thinking on cybernetics, Wiener wrote The Human Use of Human Beings, Cybernetics and Society, which was published in 1950. And like Paul Valéry, Wiener saw various types of human organization as machines, but lifeless ones. He wrote, "I have spoken of machines, but not only of machines having brains of brass and thews of iron. When human atoms are knit into an organization in which they are used not in their full right as responsible human beings, but as cogs and levers and rods, it matters little that their raw material is flesh and blood. What is used as an element in a machine is an element in the machine. Whether we entrust our decisions to machines of metal, or to those machines of flesh and blood, which are bureaus and vast laboratories and armies and corporations, we shall never receive the right answers to our questions unless we ask the right questions." It may be that Wiener's warnings about being an element or cog in a machine could focus our attention in the wrong place, however. Many of the technologies and organizations, including today's generative AI technologies, are not like printing presses, and they do not have cogs. And they do not standardize as much as they personalize, with personalized medicine, browser and consumer recommendations, customer service responses, prompt responses, and media content. The signature aim of big data is this hyper-personalization, in which the person is made into a context all their own. What we mean by the human use of human beings will likely have to change as a result of this shift to personalized interfacing. it will take some new thinking to glean how this aspect of technology works on us, what tendencies it shows, and how those tendencies change over time, and how to assess the intended and unintended consequences of hyper-personalization at both the personal and the societal scale. One possibility here, older machines subordinated the will of their users to their functions. If you recall Fritz Lang's film Metropolis, with the worker who's mimicking the hands of a clock and is forced to follow with his movements, the clockwork movements, and he becomes rather like the clock. In this way, older machines would make your will into their will. But these often engage some element of your will, the personalized machines. And what does it mean when a machine engages part of your will in the interface? And that, I'll leave it at that, because I'd like to open it to my co-panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Halle, for choosing exactly the quote from Norbert Wiener that I had thought of using in my introduction before I chose the other one. So there we are. It was a very nice case of, shall we say, human-human interaction, unintentional human action that turned out to be intentional. There are many questions that her contribution has raised, but our subsequent panelists will do the same, so please be patient and listen to the others. Our next speaker is Jutta Almendinger, president of the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin for Social Research and a member of this Academy. I must hasten to add that she is a sociologist and not a political scientist, as she was falsely identified as being on the advertiser. She's headed the Wissenschaftszentrum since 2007. Before that, she led the Zentrum für Arbeitsmarkt und Berufsforschung in Nuremberg. She's received numerous honors, including an honorary doctorate from the University of Tampere in Finland, and was awarded the Bundesverdienstkreuz First Class in 2013. Her numerous publications focus, among many other topics, on the sociology of the labor market, inequality, and sociology of the life course. Her most recent book is, in German, Es geht nur gemeinsam, wie wir Geschlechtergerechtigkeit endlich erreichen, how we will finally achieve not social but gender justice, published in 2021. Jutta.
Thank you very, very much, Mitch, for this very nice introduction. Thanks for having me on this panel. And thanks to Christoph Markschies as well for giving me this huge responsibility to head this group working on good work in the future. And I refer in parts to this volume, which is not yet released, but will appear next January, by the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Science and the Leopoldina and other unions, but not all unions, to put it like this. Well, I'm not referring back to Wiener, but I refer back 10 years ago when Frey and Osborne published a very, very important paper in which called The Future of Employment, How Successful Are Jobs to Computerization. And the prediction has been that 47% of all jobs in the US were at high risk of automatization in perhaps a decade or two. Public attention was extremely high and still is. Research funding agencies issued new funding calls. Policymakers began to craft policies. Now, 10 years later, a huge transition can be observed indeed. Many jobs were automized, new jobs, however, popped up. And this is something which they did not consider. Unemployment, at least in Germany, went down considerably. The necessity of retraining for new jobs went up tremendously. So we didn't lose half of all jobs, we actually gained jobs. Frey and Osborne, in the Future of Work discourse, has focused exclusively on paid work in the labor market. This is important. This is despite the fact that productive work in the labor market and reproductive work in the domestic sphere are equally vital for the functioning of societies. And this is why in this piece for the Berlin Academy of Science we look at both paid and unpaid work when we talk about work in general. Now, to see how important it is to really look at the whole picture, you have to know that people aged 15 to 64 years old spend about 43% of all their time on unpaid domestic work. So this is more or less half of the time they spend. I mean, half of the time paid and half of the time in unpaid domestic work. Past technological transformations have impacted unpaid domestic work just as much affected as paid work. Time use data show this very clearly. Time spent on cooking, cleaning, laundry decreased dramatically from 1920 to 2000. In the near future, the adoption of AI-powered technologies might result in further decreases. Just think about the robot vacuum cleaners or the development of educational technologies for children. As societies age, practitioners debate whether AI technologies could also replace most of the labor involved in caring for older adults. And this, with aging societies, of course, creates an enormous problem. Understanding these potential changes to unpaid work in the domestic sphere is therefore clearly important for policy making and investment. But until recently, there was no, as I said before, single study which attempted to quantify these potentials. This paucity of studies on unpaid work is consistent with the historical tendency to focus on paid employment only to the exclusion of other forms of work, especially work undertaken predominantly by women. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, this changed, and a report was published by Ledonvita, Shi, Hertog, Nagase, and Ota, a team of British and Japanese scholars. And they indeed filled this research gap. They estimated that on average 39% of the time people currently spend on unpaid domestic work could be automated within the next 10 years. So 39% is clearly less than the 47% predicted by Fry and Osborne, but it is a considerable amount of time. If we look at this more closely, then we find huge differences in the selected 17 different tasks which they sort of aggregated under domestic tasks. So grocery shopping can be automized to close to 60%, but physical childcare, for example, only to 18% within the next 10 years. Huge differences indeed, and I don't want to go into more detail because it's clearly ranked according to the amount of care involved in the domestic work. This is very much in line with previous literature which shows that routine work is much more open for automatization than non-routine work, such as assisting or caring for others, negotiation, or social perceptiveness. Let me add that Norbert Wiener and others used a different method. While Fry and Osborne only used quantitative methods, they added qualitative data, and in particular, they talked to experts at great lengths. And in particular, those experts over and over indicated that they are more than hesitant that although it would be possible to sort of automize part of the care work, it would be difficult and entirely unacceptable by the people. And I just give you one quote. I consider, and this is one of the expert statements, I consider this to be the very last thing society will ever accept as suitable for automated service. And other opinions that's the same, looking at children or the elderly. And they said this although the task was clearly not to look at non-technical functions. So they were asked not to look at societal implications of automatization. But they said, well, we can't do this. I mean, in particular, looking at care work, we have to consider what it does to a society. And so, in conclusion, I would indeed say that this part of bringing in both paid and unpaid work is a considerable step forward when we talk about AI in the future of work, in the future of good work. This is in particular important because a lot of feminists claim over and over again that in particular in technological developments, women are not part of the research. There are much less women in STEM in STEM professions than men, and therefore this entire range of jobs is left out, and therefore we lose information which we should have, and this together and in conclusion is really a sign that we should be much more open to diverse teams in looking at technological transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well. We've heard now from history and sociology, and we're now going to turn to law. And Sarah Mohammed, you moved your head, so that means you are listening to what we say and are in contact, which is great. Sarah Mohammed is professor of law at the University of California at Berkeley and Anna Maria Callan Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. She's also vice president of the American Society of International Law. Her work focuses on responsibility and culpability in situations of armed conflict and mass atrocity. Among her many publications, she is editor of Rules for Wrongdoers by Arthur Ripstein, published in 2020. She previously served as senior advisor in the State Department's, the Office of the U.S. Special Envoy in Sudan, to be specific, provided counsel on the resolution of civil war there and assisting the work of the International Court of Human Rights in Darfur. So she has concrete experience in policy as well as in legal theory. Sarah, please.
Thank you, Mitchell, for that introduction, and many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be here today and for so generously making it possible for me to participate despite my being under the weather. I'm a scholar of human rights and the law of war and not of AI, and my work focuses on how the law conceives of relationships of power and authority in characterizing responsibility for wrongdoing in mass violence and armed conflict. So I want to use my few minutes of introductory remarks tonight primarily to highlight the ways in which human agency in the context of war and mass violence is already being circumscribed, not by AI, but by other humans. So my theme really is a subset of the human use of human beings. I'm using that term human descriptively, not normatively. And I'll turn to the human abuse of human beings and a further subset, the governmental abuse of human beings. My current research addresses the ways in which governments exploit their own military service members and the ways in which the law tolerates and even promotes that exploitation. International criminal law and the law of war primarily regulate a government's treatment of civilians and of adversary combatants. But these bodies of law, as well as US law, have little to say about how a government treats its own service members. I argue this is by design. It's not just law, it's also in culture. The law reflects and reinforces a long-standing and pervasive conception of military service members as tools, as instruments of their state, as mere resources. Now, some might say, well, of course, what are soldiers but resources for their government to expend? Or they may say, of course, what else could be done when war is necessarily dangerous to life and safety? So I want to argue that exploitation of military personnel happens in ways that we don't even acknowledge, and that exploitation of military personnel goes well beyond what is necessary for the purpose of fighting or winning wars, and that exploitation of military personnel goes well beyond what it should if we take seriously a government's obligation to treat individuals under their control with dignity and respect. So when we ask about the human use of human beings, I argue that we don't give enough thought to the ways in which we allow governments to use people to the most destructive ends, not only destructive ends for the enemy soldiers or for the civilians who were caught in the crosshairs, but for soldiers of the government prosecuting the war. Now, in some cases, the exploitation by governments of their people is obvious. The Russian government is throwing thousands of lives away in its war against Ukraine. It's forcing conscripts to go to war. It's buying prisoners' freedom and often death. It's doing so to fight a war of aggression, a war that defies the foundation of the entire legal world order that was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. And yet, this same legal world order allows Russia to conscript individuals to fight its war. Conscription's permitted under international law as long as it's not of children or of individuals under occupation. Under international law, Russia is allowed to turn these people into weapons and leave them to die. And the individuals being conscripted have no formal recourse. They can try to flee, but a person fleeing conscription into an aggressive war isn't necessarily a refugee, so they're not guaranteed any protection. A person being used by their government for their death has no legal means of recourse. Now, forcing a person into a life-threatening situation is, of course, not the only way to exploit them. I'll turn to another, compelling another person to commit a crime. The accomplishment of mass violence, whether in armed conflict or in large-scale atrocity crimes like crimes against humanity that could take place outside the context of war, these typically rely on hierarchy and often military hierarchy in which subordinates agree to carry out the will of their superior. In militaries throughout the world, these hierarchies are formal and are said to be crucial for order and discipline. And since World War II, these hierarchies are understood to also be opportunities for abuse and for the accomplishment of wrongdoing. One of the most significant popular legacies of the post-war trials of German leaders, for example, is the idea that just following orders is not a defense. Now, international law actually says differently. Following orders is a defense to a crime as long as the crime is not manifestly unlawful. But the removal of what was called the superior orders defense from manifestly unlawful acts, it's thought to be a major triumph in the law. Triumph has created a cultural fixation on the agency of the subordinate. When a person is ordered to commit a crime, the focus is typically on that person. What choice did they make? Did they resist the order? Did they know it was unlawful? Should they have known it was unlawful? Would a person of ordinary intelligence have known it was unlawful? Our approach emphasizes agency and choice of the person who receives the order, but it also fails to recognize exploitation and instrumentalization, the wrongs committed by the person who gives the order. So let's shift our gaze from the person who receives the order to the person who gives the order. When Donald Rumsfeld, for example, told interrogators to take the gloves off, what was he doing? In international and domestic criminal law in the United States, a person who orders a subordinate to commit a crime can be held liable as an accomplice to that crime or as an indirect perpetrator of that crime as long as the crime is perpetrated or attempted by that subordinate. If a person orders their subordinate to torture, then they're guilty of torture if the subordinate complies. But the order is treated by the law as just a pathway to liability. It's not seen as an independent wrong. I argue that it should be. It's an abuse of authority over another person. It's improper instrumentalization and objectification of another. It's a violation of an obligation of protection towards the subordinate, and it's a violation that for some service members produces deep mental and emotional distress. I contend that we should think of the order not just as a pathway to crime, but as an abuse in itself, that we should take more seriously the ways in which individuals with power or authority abuse those who are subject to their control, and that our failure to do so stems from our failure to take this instrumentalization seriously as a form of wrongdoing, because we are enamored by ideas of autonomy and agency and insist that any person who is influenced by another allows themselves to be influenced and thus merits complete responsibility for their conduct. Both can be true, however. A person can allow themselves to be influenced and responsible for their conduct, and the act of influencing can still be wrongful. Some of the legal theory around indirect perpetration comes close to these ideas. Roxane's theory of perpetration through another is that the indirect perpetrator, the person who gives the order, dominates the direct person, the person who carries out the order, and that the indirect perpetrator reduces that direct perpetrator to a mere instrument, will automatically and without reflection carry out the will of the indirect perpetrator. It's a powerful insight that has transformed the law of perpetration. But what we are missing in it is the wrongfulness of reducing the dominated person to a mere instrument. The wrongfulness lies in the improper use of the relationship of authority. It lies too in the manipulation of the instrument's will. The mere instrument may still have preferences, beliefs, moral and ethical frameworks for operating in the world, moral and ethical frameworks that the indirect perpetrator has manipulated so that their own will be carried out readily by the subordinate. The wrongfulness is in turning a person into an instrument. In Colin McDougall's harrowing novel, Execution, the men of the Canadian Army unit fighting in the Italian campaign in 1943 buckle and harden and endure guilt and despair after Brigadier Ian Kildare orders his men to shoot 2 Italian deserters. Execution, says one of the soldiers, is the ultimate degradation of man. In the context of war and crimes in war, our attention is naturally and appropriately on the harms that the victims endure. But there is degradation, too, in crime undertaken by a person upon the order of a superior who's supposed to be entrusted with protecting them. There's degradation in being made into a tool to accomplish wrongdoing. And that's where I think we should be careful about these discussions of AI. We ask what happens to human agency if we hand the reins over to the robots, but we haven't even begun to address what happens to human agency when we hand the reins over to other people. We haven't even begun to grapple properly with how willingly we let a government exploit its people in the name of war. I'll make one other point just quickly about expendability in AI, which I hope we can take up more in discussion. And it's that some of these discussions around AI or technology more generally raise the question of whether this can help save lives in war. And indeed, technological developments in war can often mitigate risks to military personnel. Think about drones, for example. For the US military, this has been argued as a way to kill with precision from thousands of miles away and to keep service members out of harm's way. But the individuals operating drones haven't been kept out of harm's way. They're out of the line of fire, sure, but they've suffered from addiction and depression. They have PTSD. They take their own lives. I'm putting aside here the crucial questions about individuals killed by drones, whether individuals targeted erroneously or those who constitute so-called collateral damage. But for the drone operators, the act of operating a drone imposes its own health consequences. So when we think about the potential impact, even the potential good that can come from technological development in armed conflict, we need to consider that the harms to the humans don't necessarily disappear, they simply change. And our failure to see exploitation where it happens, our willingness to expend the lives and health of military personnel, it'll continue. The technology isn't going to fix that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for introducing this profound question and refocusing our debate in a very significant and useful way. You will now hear why I have arranged this discussion in this particular order, because the last part of Sarah's talk leads quite nicely into our next speaker's expertise. We turn to Rainer Forst, professor of political theory and philosophy at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main, director of the research center Normative Orders there, and a member of this academy. He received the Leibniz Prize of the German Research Council in 2012. His research areas are political theory, tolerance, and political and social justice. Among his many books in English are Toleration in Conflict, Past and Present, translated in 2013, published with Cambridge University Press, and Normativity and Power, translated in 2018 and published with Oxford University Press. And he is a major expert on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and I already mentioned Kant, and you will hear why now.
Thank you so much, Mitch, for these kind words of introduction. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. Now, I'll mainly speak about the human use of human beings. I'll speak a little about the humane or inhumane use of human beings, following up on what Sarah has been saying. And only at the end, I will say something about the non-human use of human beings, which brings us back to the topic. I also apologize for my voice. As Mitch said, I'm from Frankfurt, and we had a big game on Saturday, and I think my voice and me got carried away a bit. So apologies. When we read the title of Wiener's book, different than he intended, as Professor Ash was saying, we shiver a little. And we shiver not just when we sit in the former Prussian Academy. We shiver because we have an intuitive conviction that one must never use other human beings as means, because they are ends in themselves, as Kant famously said, and ends are not means, aren't they? I won't be dwelling too much on this, but I think it may be worthwhile to look a bit into the philosophical background, as Mitch has been inviting me for thinking that way. Moral philosophy is full of doctrines, and Kantian doctrine is not the dominant one, especially not in the Anglo-American discussions. Utilitarianism, for example, is a famous moral philosophical doctrine which has no problem with instrumentalization of human powers. And so what I say mainly refers to the shiver we get when we are Kantians in some way. Not every moral philosopher has that shiver. In his famous groundwork on the metaphysics of morals, Kant famously argues that humans regard themselves, and by rational implication all others, as ends in themselves, as Zwecke an sich selbst. And that means they are not bloß als Mittel zum beliebigen Gebrauche für diesen oder jenen Willen to be used, not merely as a means to the arbitrary use by this or that will. He repeats this in the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which says that we should always regard the humanity in each person, including ourselves, and treat persons always as an end and never, and here again it comes, merely as a means. The German formulation is jederzeit zugleich als Zweck, also as an end, niemals bloß als Mittel, never merely as a means. So our first intuition, our shiver, wasn't quite wrong, but it wasn't also quite right, because we humans use each other all the time. I use the wisdom of my colleagues to get more knowledge. I use the skills of a great chef to have a nice meal. And there are many other ways in which we use each other. So what we're talking about about the rationality of that shiver is a particular way of using others, namely, just as Sarah was saying, to be reducing another as a mere means, and that's what we should call instrumentalization. Our using each other in a way of using the wisdom of each other is not an instrumentalization. So there must be a threshold between a legitimate use of another human being and an illegitimate one. So where is that threshold? Well, the liberal-minded says, oh, that's easy. All uses of another to which he or she freely willed and consented to, these are not instrumentalizations. So to be used as a worker in a company or as a soldier, in which is a more difficult example if you think of conscription, what Sarah was talking about, to be used as a worker in a company where the time, the thought, and the body of the worker is used is fine if it's according to contract. Now think about it. This is true of a number of cases, but some contexts, not just conscription and war, but also families which have highly asymmetrical relations where children are usually not being asked to sign a contract about what their parents can do to them, though sometimes that may not be such a bad idea. Jutta is the expert on these issues. Now, but even in contexts of, say, the economy or in other everyday contexts, to think that people are free, are in a position to voluntarily sign up to a contract about what's going to happen to them is an illusion, right? People sign all kinds of contracts out of misery, desperation, ignorance, and so on. So the libertarian idea is pretty much an illusion. We need another threshold to distinguish instrumentalization from a legitimate use of other human beings, and it has to be a counterfactual threshold. It has to be a question of what would another, as an equal, have reasons to reject that I do to him or her, or that is being done, even including being done by machines and artificial intelligence. So that's a standard you might say, oh, that's complicated, right? What would others agree to under conditions of full information, symmetrical power, and so on? You see the Frankfurt critical theory background here, but that's what it is. It's the most rational reconstruction of the Kantian idea. That is a standard which calls us always to think twice about what we think is a legitimate use of the other, because factually we never are equals, but counterfactually. And morally speaking, we ought to respect the other as an equal, even if he or she may be a soldier who is under our command. Now, in that light, words that Mitch was referring to, human resources and human capital, should also make us shiver. But I think in Frankfurt dialectical terms, these terms have an advantage because they speak the truth about the system we live in, right? Whereas terms like Arbeitnehmer don't really, even though they sound much more humane. But if you live in a system where there is exploitation, you'd better have words which express it. Now, maybe we can regard societies generally, and I'll come to a close, past and present, as orders in which there's a constant struggle about which structures reproduce forms of instrumentalization which ought to be changed, which ought to be addressed and criticized. I think this is a critical way to look at societies, that there's always struggles to look at things we found normal or legitimate and ask what forms of power relations, or forms of domination and instrumentalization are actually implied here. We could even venture to suggest to look at societies as class societies defined by the use, by the perceived use value that groups and persons have. There are those who have superior resources at their disposal to determine how others are being used or, as has been suggested on this panel, abused. There are those who are seen as highly useful and skilled, such that one is careful not to instrumentalize them too much. This is the skilled workers group that Jutta also does research on. And at the lower end of such a spectrum are those who have some use value, but especially as automatization progresses, they are more and more exchangeable, right? They are needed, they are useful, but what they do, what they can offer is exchangeable. This is a precarious situation. And now you thought this is the group of the worst off. But no, the worst off really are those who are seen as useless in a society. They are the homeless, the stateless, the rightless. They always have a less affixed to them. And if you think that it takes dictatorships to produce such groups, just think about the situation of homeless, or think about the current European migration regime, where people are relocated into a void of the risk of death and hardly have any legal means, or have no legal means to address this. Now, so far, the critique of instrumentalization has been assuming that there is an agent who instrumentalizes others. And I think a lot of there's a twofold worry about AI, and that's, Mitch, I'm sorry, my last sentence. The one is that AI gives powerful groups more means to control and instrumentalize others. That is still within the framework of the domination of groups by other groups. But there's another worry which we have addressed earlier on, and also Christoph Markschies referred to it, namely that there may come a period at which we are dominated without dominators, at which there are non-human entities dominating humans, and as bad as being dominated by humans is, it might be worse to be dominated by non-humans, because the responsibility question is diffuse, right? And so there is, well, we can talk about this later. The human, non-human here is too stark a distinction about what's going on. But I think there's a huge worry that the language of injustice that we use to address domination, instrumentalization, exploitation may no longer be appropriate once we don't know exactly or lose the grip on what actually are the dominating forces that we lose our autonomy to. Thanks.
Thank you, Rainer, for, in your final sentences, raising the topic that is actually, at least in my mind, the topic that unifies all of these contributions. The topic being consent, or consensuality, or if we put it another way, what does that mean, even, to speak of consent in the situations we've been discussing? I want to raise this question to all of you individually, because you've approached it sometimes only implicitly in your contributions, but from very different places. And I'm going to start with Holly again, because in your presentation, Holly, it seemed like personalization is not a problem per se, but I would say, I would take the position of the kleine kid, the little kid from Brooklyn saying, "Oh yeah, who says?" It's a product, personalization, isn't it? that's on offer, and that when you actually agree to participate in this apparently personalized marketing system, you discover that it's not really personalized. It's actually a machine system that gives you only certain numbers of options. And if you have to agree to participate in the system in order to be personalized, yes, no?
First of all, I didn't say it wasn't a problem. I just said that we'd have to think about it differently because it functions differently. But it's a fair, it's a good question. On the subject of consent, I think it's kind of interesting that the Comenius model is much more like more recent models in terms of the way that the will is engaged, because the pupil is not supposed to be will-less entirely, and also is not actually supposed to absolutely conform in a lot of circumstances. And even Comenius talks about how there shouldn't be an absolute standard that everyone needs to follow, but there is a kind of background goal for Comenius, and that background goal is that everyone should have the chance to be saved. He was a Christian, and so he really wanted everyone to know about God, and so education was about getting to God. And so the presumption was that everyone would consent to that as an aim. And I think the other side of consent, has to do with some form of intent, which is, what is the intention of the system that is engaging with you, and what does that system want of you? And there, I think the personalization matter is quite interesting. I was reading Simone Weil a couple of days ago with a group of people, and I thought it was interesting how she said that personalism, this Christian idea of the interwar period, one thing that it didn't get is that you can't really abstract people out from through attributes. Like you can't take away some part of the person and, including the personality, and call that the person. The person is everything about them. It's not the color of their eyes or their personality or, what they would consider, some version of themselves. It's not exclusively what's going on inside their heads. It's everything about them. And I think this is interesting when we're talking about personalization. Personalization is an optimization of particular personal characteristics, so that, let's say, for diagnostic purposes, there might be a lot of factors taken into account that have to do with your environment, your medical history, et cetera, your blood group. And so there are a lot of these factors. It's sort of thicker than it was historically, this optimization, but it still is an abstraction of factors. So is there, are we more comfortable with a higher level, with a bigger number of data points? Do we feel like more of us is therefore, being personalized towards as these data points are thickened? I don't necessarily think so, but I do think that it requires a different mode of approach than the assumption that, optimized for one characteristic, or we're being homogenized, because I think homogenization is happening at some level, yes, but for the purposes of personalization, we're precisely being atomized. And it's that atomization gesture that is part of, one of the goals of big data that I think needs to be accounted for in different terms.
Sarah, you mentioned this briefly in your presentation, but I want to push you a little bit on it. Many soldiers, the conscript issue we've understood. But I'm thinking about now the vast majority of soldiers, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, who are not conscripts and who, quote, signed up. And the issue there, of course, is did they sign up for this? Right? So in other words, what can consent actually mean in these circumstances?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think consent is a bit of a red herring here, and it's also a sort of a common way to think about some of these issues, or at least it's a quick response to pointing out some of these instances of exploitation. And the idea, as you said, it is, this is what they signed up for. This is what they agreed to. This is job. They're being paid for it. They accepted the terms of this deal. And I think that that's the wrong way to think about this, in large part because governments have obligations toward individuals who are under their authority and control. That's the nature of human rights law. That's the nature of democratic obligation if we're talking about particular kinds of government. So at least post 45, a government has certain obligations with respect to its people, and that's true also with respect to military service members. Now, for a long time, there was something of a debate about whether human rights obligations applied in wartime. That's not really a debate anymore. We can talk about what the specifics are and how those obligations might change in times of armed conflict versus outside of armed conflict. But the fact is that the government has those obligations. And so when it comes to protecting, say, the right to life, if we're talking about exposing service members to unnecessary dangers, whether that's in the context of combat, such as sending them out into battle with inadequate armor, knowing that they're doing so, or whether it means providing individuals with improper training or malfunctioning equipment, there is a clear human rights obligation there that the government is expected to fulfill, and consent cannot change that. A person cannot consent to their government abusing them. The same is true in the criminal law, at least in Anglo-American criminal law and in international criminal law. There are certain acts that a person cannot consent to, and that's because there's a public interest in those acts not taking place. When it comes to this, another kind of exploitation that I talked about, and that's illegal orders, the obligation of protection is one that comes from the nature of military service. So responsible command is an obligation of the law of war. It's required in order for an armed group to be recognized as such under the law of war. And responsible command entails an obligation on the part of commanders towards those who are subordinate to them. And in exchange for that obligation of protection on the part of the superior towards the subordinate, there's an obligation of obedience on the part of the subordinate towards the superior. So when we talk about consent, that often leads to another conversation about sort of the independence of that subordinate in situations of illegal orders, right? So the person who is subject to the illegal order has not only the freedom to refuse that order, but also the responsibility to do so. And that's right that they have the responsibility to do so under the law. But that doesn't mean that the order itself is not an abuse, right? The person, sure, has the obligation to disobey that order, and that comes from their freedom, which I'm going to think of as sort of linked to your initial question about consent. But the violation is still there. The consent doesn't change that when it comes to government obligations towards those who they are in control or exercising some authority over, and that freedom doesn't change it when it comes to these obligations of protection.
Jutta, when we discuss this issue in the context of changing patterns of work, and in particular, I think your presentation was not only about that, but about changing patterns of paying attention to the changing patterns of work. Consent can be a very fraught question, it seems. In the past, some argued against the early feminist movement. Well, you agreed to this, right? But of course, the law made it quite clear that they had little choice, women, I mean. Other than if they wanted to be married at all, they had to do it this way. And that has changed to a certain extent, at least, but perhaps not quite as far as some would wish that it could go. And the same thing might be said about agreeing to caregiving arrangements. family obligation, that is the obligation of members of families to be the first participants in caregiving, is legally there, isn't it? And so it's a similar kind of analogy that you have a legal framework within which consent is even, what consent even is, has been already decided. Is that correct?
In a way, yes. I mean, I see in this work which I presented at least 3 different types of disconsent or non-consent or not being able to offer consent. And the first is looking at all those expert ratings. They say, well, compared to paid work, this care work can't be automized. And I probably don't even agree with this, of course.
The Japanese are using robots right now.
So they are saying much more, it should not be automized. I mean, those 20% which can be automized are probably care robots or something like this. So they are primarily saying, those experts, they should not be automized. And this, of course, means giving disconsent to automatization. But on the other part, you also see that in particular the children and the elderly, and I would say the sick people, don't have the power for disconsent. I mean, the young people can be instrumentalized quite easily. They don't know it differently. If they are educated by non-human beings, I mean, how should they know? So, I mean, there is no way of disconsent. And the sick people and the old people don't have actually the physical power to disagree, to give no consent. So, I mean, there are all those ethical questions, which means that we need to have societal decisions to make and not leave it to the people, if I would say the victims of it.
In other words, it's social relations all the way down.
Of course.
And of course, you don't have to be a sociologist to say that. So, Rainer, what do you think at this point? We have been confronting normative claims with empirical arrangements that are really quite varied and in some cases antithetical to what the norms would prescribe. And of course, philosophers have always had to deal with this. It's not exactly a new issue. It's perhaps a bit newer in legal theory, only 100 years old now, or 120 years old, that legal theorists have had to think about the consequences of law as part of the content of law, which they didn't always do before that. So what about philosophers? Are we further along in that way as well, about thinking about the consequences of a principle before articulating it? Or while articulating it?
Yes, I think the discussion shows that at the moment of consent, even if people are in a situation where consent is viable, you are informed, you're not suffering from an extreme situation of powerlessness where you have no other choice but to sign. Even there, we know that given the complexity of the structures we move in, consenting now to something that has consequences you could not foresee, right, is something that should give us a pause. There's a fetish about consent, which we have to be careful about, not just when it comes to people who are ill, who are sick, and people who are poor and have no other choice than consenting to a lot of things that are being done to them, and then are constantly reminded that, yes, you did consent, and you brought up gender relations where we have similar issues, and I mentioned children who are in a situation where they can't really protest against something they have not signed up. The military is another example. So we shouldn't fetishize consent. But since we're now on a track of almost throwing consent away, we should also, being dialectically aware, saying that in a number of such asymmetries of power situations, consent is very important issue. Think of the discussions about sexual ethics around rape and these issues where consent is a viable and an important issue to keep in mind and to say, these people are not in a situation of being able to consent or non-consent can also be dangerous. So there are two sides of this. Yes, we always have to look at the situations in which people are in and whether consent can actually be a normative force here, but we also should think about social contexts in which in former patriarchal times no one thought of asking for consent, but now there are rightful movements saying that a no is a no and not a half yes or so, and we should think about these situations too. So power is always the defining issue, and asymmetrical power, and so sometimes that speaks against fetishizing consent, sometimes for making consent a real force in social life.
I wasn't being facetious when I said it's social relations all the way down, because as you may remember from the introductory statement, the idea that the machines and the technology are somehow separate instances that have nothing to do with individuals, that impose upon individuals, is simply mistaken. It's about what technology does with us, and not only about what we do with technology. The related but not the same question. And that goes back to the personalization issue as well, of course. It's about a social relation mediated through technology, and not about technology doing something to us. It would seem clearly to be the case. Our time has already come to an end, at least the formal time. But I believe we can take a few minutes to take one or two questions from the audience, if you have some. I'm sure you have millions of questions. But let's try to take one or two and see if that will help. Yes, please.